Ready. Play.
Novak Djokovic, just because I think it's a storyline that we're still just about clinging to. Of course, he's recently withdrawn from Miami. The reasons for which are not super clear, but I guess we can draw our own conclusions. Before we look at maybe even that specific element, let's just talk about the match against Nardi and maybe just some question marks about his form in 2024, Steve.
Yeah, he was very critical. He thought he played very, very badly. You know, he was as blunt about that as he was about his performance against Sinner in the semis of the Australian Open. Very different kind of a problem because against Sinner, obviously, he was just, for 2 sets, he couldn't find the court. He just really was making a ton of unprovoked mistakes and was beating himself, and Sinner was rock solid, and it was fine. He got a little better, but lost in 4. Here, obviously, you're playing a lucky loser. You know how those guys react. It's not he. I think the reason he was so perturbed when it was over was that he knew there was just no way. It's not a match. It's just he shouldn't have felt as that he was under that kind of pressure. It was a subpar performance in a totally different way, John, is I guess what I'm getting at. It wasn't that he was making a ton of unforced errors, but he was making them at the wrong times. I mean, I noticed it from the outset. Obviously, he lost the first one, came back and won the second, lost in 3. First set, in the first 4 service games of Nardi, he had either deuce or 30 all.
Okay.
All 4 games. Somehow he just didn't pounce. I felt like it was there for the taking. And then amidst it all, he plays a loose game on his serve and lets it get away at 2 all, 40-15 he had, and he let that game get away, which was very costly because it was the only break of the set. Then you thought, I imagine you did too, John, felt the way I did when Djokovic won the second set, despite the incident with the where he was so upset with the umpire because he felt that Nardi had stopped. It was an apparent double fault that wasn't a double fault because obviously the electronic lines. I can see why Nardi, as the ball landed, it was dangerously close and it looked like it could have been long, but obviously when you don't hear a call. So we know that Nardi in that instance, he kind of half stopped. He didn't completely stop. Stopped and then started moving again, and Novak was thrown off. He hit a drop shot. Then he stopped, and Nardi passed him. And obviously he wanted the umpire to call hindrance. It wasn't going to happen. He was wrong in this instance. I can see why he felt like he had been wronged, and he was in some senses, but the rule is the rule, and you weren't going to win that argument. But despite that, I mentioned that moment because that was a 2-love in the second set. He had finally broken Nardi, and he's trying to get to 3-love, and he loses the game. But then he still won the set 6-3. He broke again. Yeah. You know, it was not a problem. It didn't end up being costly, that lost service game, because he broke again and nearly broke an additional time, won the set 6-3. And you had to feel going into the third that this was going to be a fairly routine third set for him. It wasn't that at all. He was very tight. He nearly lost his opening service game and eventually he did get broken, and the one break was it. And he never came close against Nardi. I think he was upset because, even in the third, one more instance I want to mention is that he's down 4-2 and he just been broken, gets it back. He has love 30. And you kind of had the feeling there, okay, if he breaks here and gets back on serve, his experience and his playing prowess and his clutchness, if I may say, would get him through. And it didn't. He just didn't come close. The 4-2 opportunity got away. The love 30 opportunity got away, and he loses. You saw the press conference, I'm sure, and he was very hard on himself. Mm-hmm. And I think, therefore, it's not shocking to me that he's not playing Miami, because I think he wants to clear his head. And I think he probably thought to himself, look, why do I have 2 choices. I could try to get right back on the horse, go to Miami, and see if I can really get this season turned around, which is still very young for him. It was he's played 3 events, but that was only his second tournament. He played the team event prior to the Australian Open, where he lost to De Minaur, but won a couple of matches, semis of Australia, and then this one here. So, he's 8-3 match record for the year. It's not up to his normal standards, but he just hasn't played enough. So in one sense, I thought, okay, maybe you just get back on the horse and try to make amends quickly in Miami. But perhaps he is thinking the better choice is no, get started, get ready on the clay now. Just start training on clay and start in Monte Carlo, really determined and knowing that you're going to play a bunch of clay court tournaments and you'll get the matches you need to try to peak at the French Open. So I don't think it's that big a deal. I can see why he'd be torn. On the one hand, get right out there and why can't you do them? If you get on a roll in Miami, you might win there. But on the other hand, it's going to be everything. It's going to be that would make the transition to clay a little bit tougher if he plays Miami. So I think he was just very upset with himself. That's the bottom line. And it was, frankly, an inexplicable loss.
Yeah, I like the expression used about clearing his head, because I think most of us have come to that conclusion more than even something physical. Although when you throw in the fact that Miami basically ends and the clay court season actually kind of in Europe at least begins the next day,
right?
With Estoril, but of course he's not going to be playing Estoril. But Monte Carlo is only another week later, and it's
right.
It does add to that stretch. But I do get the impression, like you do, that it's a clear the head decision, which is quite unusual for most tennis players. But I'm not sure. A couple of days late, when the announcement was made, maybe it didn't come as that big a shock.
No, I mean, yeah, it's not a big shock. I think he's so aware. Also, it's funny how it works. Here's a guy that plays 12 tournaments last year, wins 7 of them. That's 3 Grand Slam titles, nearly a 4th, where he's in the final of Wimbledon and he's 1 set away, and perhaps 1 point away if he doesn't miss the swing volley. So on top of that, he wins 2 Masters 1000s. He wins the year-end championships. It was a spectacular year. Yeah. And that's not that long ago. So I think he feels the reverberations because everybody else is making such a big deal, especially since it was such a subpar performance against Sinner in Australia. If he'd lost to Sinner 7-5 in the 5th, the talk might have been very different. But he feels all that. And then I think what really irked him, John, was, as you know, he got to California a couple weeks early. He brought his family over. He was around LA a lot. He was training a lot. I think he was taking this tournament very seriously and thought to himself, okay, this is where I jumpstart my season. I'm coming back to Indian Wells for the first time in 5 years, and I'm going to win it. I think that was his attitude. And then to lose a match like this, it's such a rare loss, worst loss he's ever had at a Masters 1000 or a Slam, to lose to a lucky loser who I believe was 123 in the world. I mean, that's not him. And it's not the kind of player. I mean, I thought he made Nardi look so much better in the 3rd set than Nardi really is, because he was so tight himself. So, yeah, I don't think it's that big. I don't sense there's any. You alluded to injuries. I don't think there are any. I don't think there was no indication of any injury. Physically, he looked fine. But as he said, he had nothing on his ball. He wasn't aggressive enough. He was playing too defensively in that match. And I think the problem, again, that people forget is that he's got this history of inordinate struggling, I would say, for a player of his caliber in the win. I mean, Rafa's more comfortable in the win. Roger's more comfortable in the win. And I think he alluded to the wind after the match, not using it as an excuse, but he said it was much windier than it had been for when he practiced for the tournament or in his opening match. So that was also a factor, because you could see him I've never been fond of the expression pull the trigger, but it's part of the tennis vernacular now, so I'll use it. And he didn't feel like he could pull the trigger. You could see it, and the finishing shots were not there. That was really handicapping him. He should have been able to cope with it better, but those were the circumstances. That was the reality. So there were so many factors, but obviously, worst case scenario, he should have won that match in 3 sets. Worst case. So that's why he's so upset, is that you can struggle with anybody, but you can't lose to somebody on that level.
There's one more point on Novak that's sort of coming across to me, but I can't quite join the dots exactly. And it's an impression more than anything scientific. But what I've seen, I remember Novak 2 or 3 years ago when he'd already got year-end number 1 sort of done, and him sort of checking out of a particular match. I think it was in Vienna in a 250. And it was like, I just think that Novak is probably slightly more susceptible to this than maybe Rafa is, for example, of the job is done now. And I've been watching him for 6 months since the slam race, and arguably the GOAT debate as well is done too. And I've been watching him quite closely since that year-end finals. I think he was desperate at the Davis Cup, so probably would include that in this and then move on from there. I've seen him super relaxed, super happy, arriving, as you said, in California 2 weeks before. I think it was, of course, with the intention of winning this tournament, but just so at ease with himself away from the court. And even on the court, you mentioned it when I spoke to you before, when that loss to Sinner, when he wins that third set, we didn't see the scream and the "I'm dialed in." I've just written that expression down about being dialed in. And I just wonder if, when matches have been slipping away from him against De Minaur, Sinner, and now this match with Nardi, whether, there's no Rafa there, there's no Carlos, or even a Yannick to some extent. Of course, one of those defeats was against him, but Carlos reinvigorated him. Rafa and Roger drove him on for the best part of 2 decades, and even probably the most motivated tennis player of all time cannot be dialed in 100% of the time. And I'm just wondering, and maybe even Novak himself doesn't know the answer to this question, are we seeing a slight 1 or 2% drop in that dialed inness, if you like?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. The other thing is, I think what makes it so complicated is he feels he's got to play this reduced schedule now. That's his concession to age, is I can still play as well as ever or close to it, but I can't play as much. And it worked out last year. It really worked out in the sense that he took his breaks, took a nice long break after the US Open all the way up to Paris-Bercy.
Yeah. And
he managed to, without playing his best in Paris-Bercy and feeling sick most of the week, and he had stomach issues, but he got through the tournament. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so he was able to but now maybe he's questioning it a bit, is that, would it have helped, for instance, to have played in Dubai? I think it would have, frankly. Just to have had another tournament and a bunch of matches in prior to coming to Indian Wells. Maybe this doesn't happen, because he's asking a lot of himself. It's a big demand on himself to play that well in a reduced schedule. It's risky. It's risky in his way. And last year, I would never say he got away with it, because he deserved everything that he got, but he was able to make it work in his favor. Now maybe he'll reevaluate a little bit. It's hard to say, because we don't, as we said earlier, we don't know exactly why he pulled out of Miami. It's all conjecture, speculation, but we got to believe in my mind, it's to peak on the clay in Paris, and it's just to turn his attention to the clay, period, now, and wipe this one out of his mind and clear his head. So, yeah, I see your point, though. There's a part of him, too, that, to get back to your point, there's a part of him that is so delighted with where he is in his career achievements and being two majors ahead of Rafa, and it's inconceivable that Rafa could catch him or pass him. And just having, all the other achievements, the 8-year-end number ones, the 420 or whatever it is right now, weeks at number one, so many things that make him content. And he has made those passing remarks about, sometimes he asks himself, why does he want to put himself through this anymore? And then the final point is what you said, because he loves the idea of these dynamic rivalries. So that was a great stretch last year to play Carlos at the French. Granted, it was a disappointing conclusion because of the cramping, but it was still a big match and a big win. Lose to him narrowly at Wimbledon, and then win the epic in Cincinnati. And that was very exciting for him, that he was so upset by the Wimbledon loss. He was very proud that he came back, beat Carlos in Cincinnati final, which gave him the confidence to win the US Open. So that was a very satisfying year. And there is a part of him right now that is probably that inner voice that's saying, why do I need to even go on? I'd rather be with the family. I've done it all. I think I put myself in a position where most people are going to say I'm the greatest player of all time. And so do I really need to push myself and be away from my family this much and put myself through this, what sometimes must seem like an ordeal, which again gets back to your point. He'll always be excited about playing the slams.
Yeah.
But the rest of the tournaments, even some of the 1000s, are not going to get him as inspired as they once did. And even there, he's got his 40 Masters 1000s. So, the targets are becoming they're receding. I mean, there're just not as many of them left now. It's adding on. Beat, move past Margaret Court and get that 25th major. Okay, if he closed in on it in Paris or Wimbledon, I think that would be exhilarating for him and might be enough to give him the emotional energy to get it done. But in some of these cases, as you just alluded to, he can't find that inspiration from within.
Olympic gold. I guess that's the other thing for him to be motivated about.
Right.
But
right.
if you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell so you don't miss out on all things tennis.